I actually was born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley, which is the southern tip of Texas, where the Rio Grande flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And so I was trained as a political scientist doing comparative politics, Latin America. And really my research had been on Mexico. But about 10 years ago, there was more and more literature about the border politics, relationship between US and Mexico and border politics. And then what happened is that around 2006, between 2006 and 2008, a border wall was built in roughly 620 miles along the US-Mexico border. And part of that border wall was built south of my hometown of Mission, Texas. So I became, of course, very interested, not only because of my intellectual interest, but also my personal interest, since it now was actually affecting my hometown. And so, so my research started way before Donald Trump brought up this issue of the border wall. I think for me, one of the frustrating things has been recently in the last couple of years has been that so many people are talking about the border wall as if it were a new thing. And in fact, the border wall that was built in 2008 was built as a result of two pieces of legislation. One of them was the Real ID Act of 2005. And the Real ID Act was mostly about standardizing information on driver's licenses across the country for purposes of security. But there's also a provision in the Real ID Act that gives the power to the head of DHS, the head of Homeland Security, to unilaterally ignore any law that interferes with the construction of barriers at the border, as long as they're designed to enhance national security. The other important piece of legislation is the 2006 Secure Wall Act. And in that piece of legislation, Congress actually says to DHS that they must build 613 miles of border wall, again, to enhance national security. In Texas, you have a very long border. You have, for example, landowners who have been very upset. I can give one case study, a village called Grande, Texas, which is again in the southern tip of Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. So they have complained bitterly about their experiences with the 2006 Secure Fence Act, and they've had several complaints. One is that the border wall that was built actually divided their village in half. And so again, this is a little town that goes back to the 1700s, has a lot of historic value, and is now cut in half by an 18-foot wall. Another group that has been very upset with the border wall, and again, in this particular area of the Rio Grande Valley, is environmentalists. This area of South Texas is a very unique place environmentally. Looks superficially a lot like perhaps Florida, with a lot of palm trees, a lot of vegetation. And it's also a place that is home to many endangered species of animals and plants. So I think President Donald Trump and his supporters have been calling for a border wall. And what I find interesting is that in that discussion, you rarely hear that we already have this 600-mile border wall. I think that a lot of people in this country either have forgotten about that wall that was built 10 years ago or were never aware of it. And I think that there is still so much fear and anxiety, and which drives people to want a real visible barrier that they could point to that would be solving these problems. And again, these problems are fear of terrorism, so wanting to protect national security, fear of the other, of undocumented people. Perhaps some people are worried that this country will no longer be a predominantly white country. The idea that some people are trying to get here and not waiting in line, not understanding the intricacies of our immigration system. And I think in general, just thinking that drug trafficking can be solved by building a border wall, whereas we know, I think, that we need to think hard about the problems of addiction in this country. The problems that these walls are supposed to address, the problems are too complicated. A lot of border scholars say that we actually, in many ways, on purpose, create these flawed projects at the border. So on the one hand, you have a border wall. We already have one now. Has it actually stopped drug trafficking? Has it stopped undocumented immigration? No, it has not. If we add even more miles to the border wall, the same is going to continue, but that is because you can't satisfy both sides at the same time. Some people still want their cheap labor or their products to go back and forth across the border. Some people still want a closed border because of their own anxieties. I think I just hope that more people pay attention, not necessarily just people who live on the border, but pay attention to something like the fact that the head of DHS has been given the right to ignore any law, as long as that person is building a barrier at the border that enhances national security. We've already had over 30 laws waived. Again, laws that having to do with the environment, with the protection of Native Americans and their property, their lands and properties, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. I think we need to think about the erosion of our democracy in light of our focus on national security.